latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are several developments on the eastern section of the front line. The Russians continue their advances within the Luhansk region to capture one of the final towns remaining under Ukrainian control. The Russians also managed to advance within the northern parts of Toretsk. The Russians also managed to capture the town of Romanivka here in the area between Toretsk and the intersection between Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk. The Russians made several advances along the NTO 504 highway connecting Pokrovsk to Bakhmut. The Russians managed to advance to the southwest of Pokrovsk, and the Ukrainians also managed to make their own advance through a counterattack just south of that. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Ukrainians managed to recapture parts of Oryhove here in the southern parts of the Donetsk region. The Ukrainians managed to recapture the parts of the first and second streets, but the Russians now only hold up to a single street on the eastern parts of the town. The Ukrainians are here attempting to regain control over the town to solidify the defensive positions ahead of the Dnipropetrovsk region, where this is the final position of the Ukrainians in the area which the Russians have not controlled, for flanking maneuvers towards the south in the direction of Oleksivka and Deshne, as well as in the western direction towards Novopavlivka and the highway supplying the Ukrainian positions to the south. The Russians managed to advance north of Kotlyarivka, where they're looking to gain control over an additional road in the direction of Novomykolaivka. With an additional road under their control, they would have an additional route into the town, allowing for 2 points from which they can enter Novomykolaivka through their supply routes, and also allow the Russians to improve the logistical situation for a push further westwards towards Muravka from the south as well. The Russians will look to gain control over both Novomykolaivka, Muravka, and the fortified positions here in the outskirts of the border area, where they'll look to enter into the Dnipropetrovsk region and flank Novoserhivka and further north. The Russian advances to the east of Pokrovsk are numerous. The Russians managed to secure their first patch to the northeast of Myrolyubivka as they continue their advances in the direction of the fortified positions between Melenivka and Myrolyubivka. The Russians managed to gain control over several fortified positions and remaining parts of Novopoltavka here in the direction of the town, as well as securing a field road and parts of the forest patch to the northeast of the town. The Russians are here expanding their offensive operations in the northern direction to expand the zone of control around the intersection and the highway. The Ukrainians have several fortified positions lined up ahead of the Russian positions. They have the defensive lines stretching north from Melenivka, which the Russians can now bypass from the rear by fighting over fortified positions north of Mirne. They also have the defensive lines southwest of Melenivka, which the Russians can flank from Myrolyubivka from the southwest and Melenivka from the northeast. The Russians also have the ability to advance north of Novopoltavka, where they can fight against some fortified positions head-on. However, these fortified positions of the Ukrainians are not defensive lines, but sporadic defensive positions built in different locations as choke points, where the objective is to prevent the Russians from making any significant breakthroughs by slowing down any offensive operations. The Russians will look to gain control over all of these fortified positions. Before moving on to capture the settlements, they'll look to gain control over Shevchenko, then move onwards towards Kupcheve, which will allow them to have a position that is overlooking the defensive line of the Ukrainians here north of Mykolaiivka. At the same time, they'll look to advance towards Popov Yar and Poltavka to gain control over those settlements as well, which will open the road for Rusin Yar. Gaining control over these 3 settlements will allow the Russians to have control over any of the Ukrainian settlements north of the highway and the intersection ahead of the defensive line of the Ukrainians connecting Mykolaiivka to Rushkivka further north. It will also open the road for offensive operations by the Russians here north of Novolenivka in the direction of Stepanivka, Dovabelka, Roshishne, and Mykolaiipilya. This will allow the Russians to have the western flank of Kostiantynivka under their control. So based on this, we can see that the Russians will look to gain control over Shevchenko, Kupcheve, move onwards towards Popov Yar, Poltavka, and Rusin Yar, and then continue onwards towards Stepanivka, and then upwards towards Mykolaiipilya. While at the same time, they'll look to gain control over Mirne, the fortified positions, and Yelisavetivka, as well as continue offensive operations towards Yablonivka here to the south and Oleksandro Kalinove. This is due to the success of the operations in the east. They'll look to continue offensive operations the south of these fortified positions as well. The Russians advanced north of Novodenivka along the residential area connected towards Yablonivka, where they will continue along the river line upwards towards Yablonivka along the fortified positions to gain control over these positions and the northern flank of the road for an additional supply road through Novodenivka towards Yablonivka and the southern bank of the river line, and the flank of this road here, where the Russians were looking in control of that as well, which have already cut off with this advance to the east of Novodenivka, where advancing along the forest lines and towards the road. The Russians are looking to gain control over the roads connecting Oleksandropol to Yablonivka, which at the same time cut off the supply road from Yablonivka down towards Zoria, one of them. The Russians have operationally encircled Hnativka and Staromykolaiivka, as well as all the fortified positions in this pocket. With the capture of Romanivka in the east, the Russians will look to attack Zoria from the east and from the west simultaneously. They'll also be looking to expand here west of Zoria along the fortified positions, widening their spearhead to the town. The Russians will look to gain control of it, completely encircling the Ukrainian positions to the south, while at the same time they'll continue offensive operations towards these fortified positions and the settlements to gain control over those. Gain control over those, and Zoria will allow the Russians to have an open road towards Oleksandro-Kalinove. And with the capture of Romanivka, the road is also open towards the rear of Novospassky on the western bank of the river line. The Russians will look to advance along the river line, along the forest lines towards Katerinivka, flanking the fortified positions and the towns of the Ukrainians here west of Toretsk. The Russians also managed to advance within the northern parts of the city, looking to regain full control over the residential area and push the Ukrainians out of the northern parts of the city. Gain control over the entire northern flank will allow the Russians to concentrate their forces in the western and southern parts of the city, looking to gain control over the fortified positions and the remaining high ground positions. This is also to complement the offensive operations here in the west, where the Russians will look to put the Ukrainians in a pincer maneuver, advancing along the road here to the northwest of Toretsk to cut off the Ukrainian positions within Novospassky and Shcherbinivka. With a combined assault from the west and from the east, they'll be able to encircle both of the towns. Moving further north, the Russians have managed to advance in the Luhansk region, where they continue offensive operations north of Novomikhailivka and south of Rekivka. Today, the Russians managed to gain control over an additional forest line here to the east and to the west of the river line, where they slowly inch forwards towards Rekivka on a daily basis. The Russians slowly move towards Rekivka from the southern flank, where they're looking to gain control over the western flank, cutting off the supply road into the town, and from the eastern flank, advancing along their own supply road, while at the same time flanking the town from the south. The Russians are walking through the cover of the forest lines with infantry to reach the town from the southern flank, and advancing with vehicles from the eastern flank, and similarly with infantry from the western flank. Today at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, it is the long-awaited phone call between Putin and Trump that will take place, where they will discuss, amongst other things, the Ukraine war. It'll be interesting to see what sort of discussion they'll have. The Russians and the Ukrainians had the negotiation rounds in Turkey, and during those negotiation rounds, nothing was really achieved. The Russians demanded for any ceasefire or for a peace deal to take place. The Ukrainians would need to withdraw from the remaining parts of the Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions. After that, they will consider a peace deal or a ceasefire. These demands from the start of the war were non-negotiable for the Ukrainians. They always have refused giving up any territory at all, not even Crimea, much less the 4 regions within eastern and southern Ukraine. The Russians, however, now have that as a key demand. They will not accept any peace deal that does not include these 4 regions. This is because the Russians have formally annexed these 4 regions and put it in their constitution, while at the same time, militarily speaking, the Russians see a roadmap to gain full control over these 4 regions with or without negotiations. Therefore, this is one of their key demands. Besides that, they have the neutral state demands, they have the limited army demand, and so much more, all of which puts Ukraine in a defeated position, where they will have nothing to answer for their situation, besides still existing as a country. Now, That is the results of the peace negotiations, which is really nothing. The Ukrainians, of course, demanded that Russia withdraw from Ukraine completely, including Crimea, as it is all Ukrainian territory.